Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. I'm Mike McFadden, President of the American Geophysical Union. Research in earth and space science inspires wonder about the world around us. It also addresses many of the great challenges we face as a society, such as how to mitigate and respond to natural hazards like tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanoes, extreme weather, and climate change. Basic research is likewise an important driver of technological innovation, economic development, and jobs creation. Google, for example, the most widely used search engine in the world and a pioneer in information technology, was started as a small research project by two students at Stanford University. Much of the basic research carried out in the U.S. is supported by federal funds. We know, though, that federal budgets are under increasing stress, which leads to uncertainties about the health and vigor of the U.S. scientific enterprise. That's why the topic of today's lecture, A New Era in Science and Engineering, is so appropriate for the fall meeting. AGU is the largest organization of earth and space scientists in the world, and our members represent a significant fraction of the American scientific talent pool in these areas. It is my great pleasure today to introduce the Director of the National Science Foundation, Dr. Subra Suresh, who will present this year's Union Agency Lecture. Dr. Suresh is a distinguished engineer nominated by President Barack Obama in September 2010 to serve as the Director of NSF. He leads the only government science agency charged with advancing all fields of fundamental science and engineering and related education. NSF's programs and initiatives keep the United States at the forefront of science, empower future generations of scientists, and foster economic growth and innovation. Prior to assuming his role with NSF, Dr. Suresh served as the Dean of the School of Engineering and the Vannevar Bush Professor of Engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His experimental and modeling work on the mechanical properties of materials has shaped new fields at the fertile interface of traditional disciplines. He has authored more than 240 journal articles, has registered 21 patents, and written 3 widely used books on materials science. Dr. Suresh has been elected to a number of prominent scientific and engineering organizations worldwide, including the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, and he has received many honors for his distinguished work. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Subra Suresh.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here. I've been to a number of different professional societies before. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to participate in this society as well. The president of AGU just mentioned that 2 co-founders of Google received federal support for now what has become as a large search engine that has changed the world tremendously. As director of NSF, it's my duty to point out that NSF supported them. So I would also like to point out that my good friend and colleague, Marsha McNett, who's here, she was an NSF-funded graduate research fellow. And so NSF has played a role in a number of these. I would like to take the next 30, 35 minutes or so to talk about some of the things that led to what NSF is today, the role of NSF in the national and international research and education, STEM education enterprise, the opportunities we face, the challenges we face, and some of the new initiatives that we have that try to position us in the best possible way for the future, given the significant constraints that we have on the horizon, primarily economic constraints that we have. So that's essentially the scope of what I would like to talk about. The title of my talk is rather ambitious, New Era of Science and Engineering, So hopefully I will convince you during the course of this talk why this is a new era and what is so new about it and how do we go about addressing it. So let me start at the beginning. NSF was founded in 1950 based on a very influential report that Dr. Vannevar Bush wrote, which went to the President of the US, and President Harry Truman accepted the report and created the National Science Foundation. It was very controversial at that time, coming right after the Second World War. And it had a thesis. There was a thesis in that report, which was what made it controversial. And it was the following. The economic prosperity of a country necessarily resides in science and engineering innovation. And that innovation primarily is given birth to by basic research in science and engineering, with an emphasis on basic research. And the basic research is best done at universities and colleges, which provide the opportunity for free pursuit of pure knowledge, basic knowledge, in addition to training future generations of leaders. And this is one of the controversial parts. It is the responsibility of the federal government to foster that ecosystem of innovation by supporting basic science. And there were a few hiccups in that report. It went back and forth, and it was accepted in the 1950, and the National Science Foundation was created. NIH also has its origins as a result of parts of that report. And the first year annual budget, if you think NSF budget is not large enough, as I do, the first year annual budget of NSF was a little more than $200,000 for the entire country. Okay, so we've come a long way. So where is NSF now? And I want to talk about the role of NSF in today's enterprise. Our annual budget for 2012 is a little over $7 billion. And the President's request to Congress for 2013, which seems so long ago, it was last February, it's a little under $7.4 billion. And the congressional markup so far is not too far from what the President had proposed on both sides, on the Republican side and the Democratic side. The President proposed 4.8% increase for NSF. The Republican House has marked up, before the election, a 4.2% increase for NSF, and the Senate about 3.5%. So that's where we are as of today. We don't know where we will be, depending on what evolves in the next few weeks and what the numbers will be, but this is the current status. One point I would like to emphasize is that out of the $7 billion that NSF receives, we spend about 6% in administering the research, cost of managing the research. The rest of it goes back to the community. So NSF is unique as a federal agency in that we do no internal research. All of the money that comes in, minus the cost of operation, which is less than 6%, goes back to the community completely. Our mandate is to fund all fields of science and engineering and related education in STEM, including social, behavioral, and economic sciences. Okay. The only thing we don't do by congressional mandate is clinical research, because that's the domain of the National Institutes of Health. But having said that, a lot of NSF work has a direct implication for clinical research. Let me give you one example. This also talks about the interdisciplinarity of research, the long-term focus of fundamental research, and the unexpected consequences and rewards and fruits of basic research. From 1971 to 1984, NSF continuously supported an applied mathematician to do economics research. His name is Lloyd Shapley. And we also supported continuously from 1979 Alvin Roth at Harvard University to do basic research on optimization on matching people who have something to give with people who have something to receive. This is economic matching, not marriage matching. So they were funded for a long period of time by NSF. They won the Nobel Prize this year. The two of them won the Nobel Prize this year in economics. We just met with them last week in Washington. Here is the beauty of the research. NSF funded it for economics, for mathematical modeling. But they were recognized for their Nobel Prize winning work for the following. Their work was applicable by bringing together patients who are looking for kidney donations with those who are donating kidneys. And who would have thought an NSF-funded mathematical research in economics would lead to a major application for matchmaking for organ donation? And that's as beautiful an example as it gets with respect to NSF's commitment to basic research and the lack of prudence in focusing on short-term results of basic research when we try to assess the importance of science. Last year, we supported 300,000 individuals in the country in more than 2,000 institutions, universities, colleges, etc. So one of the difficult things that we have to do, and this community is very much aware of this, the geosciences community or the AGU community is very much aware of this, the very delicate balance between supporting cutting-edge research, providing resources for the best facilities, which are very expensive and which need to be renewed continuously to keep the community at the forefront of science. At the same time, doing both of them so that you can excite young people to go into the field and give them opportunities and resources and facilities to do the best work, try to fund the best ideas and the best people. And this is a fine line to walk. So in the NSF Geo Directorate, or in astronomy and mathematical and physical sciences, in some parts of mathematical and physical sciences, a big chunk of the budget goes for facilities. And that doesn't come necessarily from NSF, it comes from the community because that's the demand from the community. And so somebody asked, what is NSF's policy on this? Our policy is to foster all kinds of ideas, big ideas and small ideas. And I want to give you an example of this. The big idea is putting man on the moon, and that galvanized a generation to go into science. It excites young people, and it really, and the product of that research has a lot of other applications in the commercial domain. That's very important, and agencies like NASA or NSF or other federal agencies want to support that. This big science, big vision, national challenge, national goal, or international competition. But remember, we put man on the moon before we put wheels on the suitcase. And having wheels on the suitcase is very useful too, and it's an innovation. It was waiting to happen, but nobody thought of it. And so NSF tries to do both. This is what I mean by simple ideas, small ideas that have broad appeal, as well as big ideas that galvanize a generation. And this is something, that was not my statement. Somebody mentioned this recently, and both are important, and that's what we try to do. And we want to fund the best people and the best ideas. So here are some numbers on the NSF has been in existence for 62 years. What is the impact of NSF? You can count it in many, many different ways. Here are some tangible metrics, and I will come to some others as we move through the talk. Since 1951, NSF has supported more than 200 Nobel Prize winners. In fact, as of this year, 204 to be exact. Okay? And that 70% of all the American Nobel laureates have had some portion of their Nobel Prize winning work funded by the National Science Foundation, including four of the winners this year. So that's the first point I would like to make. And this is only a $7 billion organization, which is a drop in the bucket compared to the US budget. And that's the impact of this. And as far as I know, there is no other funding agency on the planet that can match this record when it comes to Nobel Prizes. Okay, so that's the first point I want to make. In some fields, so that's 70% of all the Nobel Prize winners since 1951. The second is that just in economics, again, SPE comes under a lot of attack from in Washington, and I want to put this point up. 47 of the economics Nobel Prize winners since 1951 have received NSF funding, including both the winners this year. And not necessarily for economics, just like in the organ donation example, it's for many different fields, but started from economics. I mentioned graduate research fellowships. So here is a quiz for you. What do the following people have in common? John Holdren, Larry Summers, Ben Bernanke, Marsha McNett, and I could go on, Sergey Brin, and a few others. They were all selected by NSF to be graduate research fellows before they became well known. And with respect to Nobel Prizes, we make two statements inside NSF. We identify Nobel Prize winning work or the potential several decades before the Nobel Prize committees do. And on average, we give them more money than the Nobel Prize committee does. And that's a fact. Okay? So the last point I want to make on this with respect to NSF's impact, industrial, economic, and societal impact. So in the 1960s, for example, we funded a lot of research, basic research, in mathematics and in computer science, before there was a formal field of computer science, into global positioning system. And at that time, it was primarily for intelligence gathering, military applications, and satellite applications. And had we asked the question, what is the practical commercial use of this, we would not have GPS in our mobile phones today, and Apple would not be able to do today what they are doing if NSF had not funded the basic research 50 years ago. Just another example, we already talked about Google. Just another example, when the National Nanotechnology Initiative was launched in 1999, NSF was one of the first federal agencies to start nanoscience and nanoengineering centers. And these centers, in the last 12 years, they were funded purely for basic research. And they have led to 180 companies that involve 1,200 major corporations, creating a lot of jobs. That's not why we funded them. That's a side product of basic science. So those are a few examples of industrial, economic, or societal impact. My last slide on NSF's current portfolio, where does NSF put its money? So the most recent year, which is 2009, so what you see here as a percent is a percent of all the federal dollars for basic research going into any one particular field. In computer science, 82% of all the academic research in basic research in the American universities and colleges is funded by the National Science Foundation. In biology, if you exclude NIH, it's 68%. In environmental sciences, 57%. This is basic research. Physical science is almost 50%. Engineering, about 40%. And all of science and engineering, 21%. So let's talk about the new era, what is new about it, and what are the forces shaping the new era on a global scale. So I would like to talk about 4 things. And again, none of this is a surprise to you, but I want to put some numbers to this. As a preamble to this, let me put a little context. 1/3 of all the research R&D funding in the world last year, adjusted for purchasing power parity, was in the US. About 1/3 in Europe, and about 1/3 in Asia, the top 10 countries of Asia. So roughly it's 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 around the globe in 3 different places. That's where we stand. 21% last year of all the publications in science and engineering, scholarly publications, were in the US, 21%. We declined compared to 5 years previously. We declined from 26% of world scholarly publications to 21%. So that means 79% of all the scientific publications now originate from outside the US, but increasingly most of the publications have authorship from more than one country, including the US, and US is a major player in this. So the four factors that shape global new era are the challenges that we face, so from which this community knows very well, from pandemics to tsunamis to earthquakes to infectious diseases to water shortages to urban migration to cities, etc., rising sea levels, ocean acidity, etc., etc. For these global challenges, we can have policies in a federal agency, we can have practices in Washington, but the challenges are international. So how do we address them, how do we engage, is going to be a huge issue. And related to that, the second aspect of the new era is that knowledge has no boundaries. So you can create knowledge anywhere, but at the click of a mouse, it can go from anywhere to anywhere else, and anywhere else somebody can have access to it, no matter who pays for it, as they originate the idea. So given that almost instant transfer of knowledge from one corner of the world to another corner of the world, just like the instant transfer of an infectious disease from a developing country to a very well-developed country just through an airline flight, there are no boundaries anymore for any of this. So that means, as a funding agency, we are a federal funding agency using taxpayer money. So our mission, rightly so, is to fund American scientists within the US borders in an increasingly globalized world that has no borders. And how do we engage? How do we create policies? How do we maintain these policies? How do we ensure them? And as we go to open access to publications and data or other kinds of free flow of information, while we protect privacy, confidentiality, intellectual property, etc., who pays for it? Who creates the policies? Who enforces the policies? And who makes sure that the information is archived in perpetuity across rapidly changing platforms? Right now, nobody. So then the question is, what is the role of the National Science Foundation in this global enterprise while we operate within the confines of the policy, while we have to abide by national policies and laws, export control laws, national security, etc.? How do we engage? And this requires a very interesting conversation with the State Department, White House, National Security Council, and others. And this is a very interesting intellectual challenge in addition to a technological challenge. The third point is shifting demographics. So let me give you a couple of data points to think about this. If you look at all the undergraduate freshmen last year around the world, the total number of undergraduate freshmen in all 50 states of the United States, plus the total number of undergraduate freshmen in all the 27 countries of the European Union, plus the total number of undergraduate freshmen in all of Japan combined last year equaled the number of college freshmen just in China. So that's the input. Now let's look at the output. College graduation. So that's the absolute number. Okay. So coming out of the college, 20% of all the college graduates in all the fields in China, 20% of them are engineers. About 20% of them are natural scientists. In the US, 11% of all the college graduates are natural scientists, and 4.4% are engineers. Okay. So that's the output. So whether you look at it in terms of absolute number or a fraction, that's the change in demographics. So looking ahead, in about 5 to 10 years, in absolute numbers, half of all the scientists and engineers will probably come from 2 or 3 countries. And those countries are not in Europe, not in North America or the Americas. So that's the shifting demographics. The last point I want to mention is shifting economics. So according to the National Science Board indicators this year, for the first time in the history of science funding, the top 10 Asian countries last year invested more in R&D than the United States. That has never happened before. And that's the shifting economics for science funding. And then you can see examples of this. It's not just the large countries. It's small countries like Qatar and Singapore investing very, very heavily in R&D, and large countries investing in them, not only for economic prosperity, but as a way to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And so that's the demographics under which we are operating at this point. So this figure shows a normalized plot. So on the x-axis, you have the R&D investment as a function of GDP, so normalized by the economic size of the country, and it's color-coded. There are 3 major colors. Green is the Americas, so United States, Brazil, and Canada are there. All the other American countries, countries in the Americas are not there because they are too small to be on this graph. Okay? On the vertical axis, it's normalized by population, the number of scientists and engineers per million population. So the size of the circle is the size of the investment. So if you add up the areas of all the green circles, that's the R&D investment in the Americas primarily. All the orange circles are Europe, and all the blue circles are Asia. So if you add up the areas of all the different color circles, they are roughly equal. Green areas are equal to the orange areas, which are equal to the blue areas. There are 2 other colors. There's one other color here with 2 countries, red. So to your bottom right is Israel, and somewhere in the middle is Russia. So those are the only 2 other countries. Obviously, you want to be near the top right. So you have enough investment, you have enough people to do the science and engineering. And the country that's closest to the top right corner is Finland. The country that's farthest to the right is Israel. And you can see most of the Scandinavian countries are doing very well, as is Japan and South Korea. The US is the big green circle in the middle. Singapore is just above the US. Denmark is there. Then just below the US, you have Switzerland, Germany, and Austria. Okay? So this is the global landscape in R&D. So now let me move from a global picture to first about what is so exciting about science now, and then talk about NSF in more detail. And what is NSF doing about embracing some of these challenges that I just articulated. So there are many intellectual drivers to this new era of science. So if you take NSF, we fund every field of science and engineering. Take experimental science. Just about 4 weeks ago, our telescope in Antarctica discovered an entire cosmological system. And about 2 years ago, we were able to drill down several kilometers inside Antarctic ice beneath the surface to look at things like carbon capture, age of the universe, pollution levels, etc. So it looks at distances that are very large with the resolution of experimental equipment that's highly sophisticated, with a way to foster scientific discoveries that we could not have imagined even a few years ago. Combine that to the other extreme of length scale, force scale, size scale, time scale, etc. So within NSF, we fund a lot of projects that go to nano, pico, and femto. So you can think of, in the area of biology, for example, a bright undergraduate student today can build a homemade device, and which one of my students did recently at MIT for $10,000, a desktop device that can pull a single DNA molecule to a force of 1 piconewton to a resolution of a nanometer. And this is something that that's possible today. And that level of sophistication we could not have imagined. And add to that the fact the whole field of genetics and genomics came into existence in a big way just about a decade ago. And now we are approaching the $1,000 genome in a day era. And that creates whole new possibilities. Add to that the fact computational science and engineering is moving very fast. And the sophistication of computational hardware and software today could not have been imagined 5 years ago. Add to that distributed computing. An iPad, the latest iPad, is capable of generating up to 1 terabyte of data per day. So that's where we are. And this new era of observation is creating a new era of data and information, which is the second most exciting thing about science. And the new era of data and information, as well as the new era of observation, touches every field of science and engineering, from mathematics to engineering to physics to astronomy to geosciences, etc., etc. And the long tail of this, which is the distributed networking, is also pretty remarkable. So the next question is, how do we take this in the context of not only research but STEM education, and how do we make sure that this information that's accessible is made accessible the right way with the right peer review mechanisms, right vetting, and the right economic model to pay for it for the long haul across rapidly evolving platforms. And this is one of the challenges that we face. And here is the sort of a plot on the big data. So what you have is storage in terms of bytes going today at the gigabyte to terabyte range. And you see some of the NSF funded facilities and facilities funded by other funding agencies. So today we had 2012 genomics, Blue Waters computer at University of Illinois, Large Hadron Collider in CERN in Geneva, climate modeling, environment modeling from the tera to the petabyte range. In the next 10 years, we're going to move from here to Exa and Zeta. Zeta is 10 to the 21. And that's the scale that we foresee at this point. And you can see it's not linear. And the change is going to be, and these are big facilities, big instrumentation. Add to that all the little devices from tweets to email, text messages, and the information that's generated. And a day before yesterday was the 20th anniversary of text messaging. And the number of trillions of text messages that have happened in the last 20 years has been mind-boggling, and it's increasing exponentially. So this is where we are right now. The next slide shows the need for big facilities and the facilities that will generate the data for the future. In fact, the next slide has a video, as an audio as well, and this is something that your community knows very well. This is the launch of the research vessel Sikuliak just about 6 weeks ago in Marinette, Wisconsin.
The Arctic Ocean is almost completely covered by sea ice for most of the year, which makes getting there a real challenge. Today, the National Science Foundation and the University of Alaska Fairbanks unveiled the RV Sikuliak, one of the most advanced research vessels in the world.
The ship is fine, by the way, don't worry. So the acting AD for Geosciences, Marge Kavanaugh, who is sitting here, she and a number of my geo colleagues, some of whom are in the audience, we all witnessed this on a cold, rainy day in Wisconsin about 6 weeks ago, and it was quite a spectacular event. And I really want to commend my colleagues at NSF. This is a project that came out of stimulus funding on time and on budget, and it was finished on time. I want to mention about Antarctica, the facilities in Antarctica. And this is the National Science Foundation is the point agency, and we work with our sister agencies, USGS, NASA, NOAA, and others, and the State Department, with 50 countries now. And Malaysia is one of the newcomers to this. And this facility is about $400 million a year, from neutrino physics to study of fish that form crystals in their bodies to survive the severe winters. This is and we found recently that the emperor penguin population is twice what it was thought previously. So there is a whole range of possibilities for research. And again, here you get results that you don't anticipate often. And if NSF doesn't do it, who would do it? And how would science suffer if it's not supported? So these are questions that don't have immediate economic value but have significant long-term impact. This is another thing that your community knows. This is in partnership with NOAA, the Argo program. So this is a float. When ships go through the oceans of the Earth, they drop this float, and you see the antenna that beams information about the temperature of the ocean, the health of the ocean. And the next video shows each dot as a float somewhere in the ocean. As of a few months ago, we had 5,300 of them. And there are about 50 NSF awards or so that support this network. This is the big data, one form of big data that comes about that scientists all over the world collect. We have NEON, Ocean Observatory Observing Initiative. We have IRIS, and many others that feed into this big data enterprise within the geo community. Of course, you all know this well at NCAR, and we had another opening just 2 days after the Sikuliaq launch. On your right is the supercomputer in NCAR, Wyoming. When I went to the launch, I asked the director of the center, can they make it as exciting as the launch of the Sikuliaq? Can they tilt it 60 degrees and put it in water? He said, no, it's not possible. I can understand why. And so this is now capable of a 1.5 petaflop computing capability. One of the things I want to, and the hyperplane that you know at NCAR in Boulder, Colorado, one of the things I want to mention is that despite the severe economic constraints that we face, our commitment to supporting as much of cutting-edge facilities has not subsided. But we need to weigh that very carefully, the balance between individual scholarship and big facilities, and prioritizing it. And this is where we really need community help, setting the right expectations. If we start facilities, is there before we start them, can we think about the lifespan and sunsetting of facilities, and also a financial model to sustain them for the long haul? If we cannot do that, it will be very difficult for us to start new facilities in the future. Just want to take a few minutes to talk about some of the topics that go beyond individual projects and individual directorates. Our largest project that cuts through all corners of NSF is the SEAS initiative, Science, Engineering, and Education for Sustainability. And every part of NSF is engaged in this. STEM education is a very important part of this. And this is very critical for a variety of topics, including climate change and all general forms of sustainability broadly. This is where I think your community has played a very critical role in helping NSF in nucleating this project. A related area, which also touches all of NSF, is the Cyber Infrastructure Framework for the 21st century. National Robotics Initiative, Nanotechnology, EarthScope, Southern California Earthquake Center, jointly with USGS, IRIS, Advanced Manufacturing Initiative, Secure and Trustworthy Computing, Materials Genome Project to bring the cost of materials and the speed of materials to implementation down by half the time compared to current practice, computational simulations and real-time networks, that I mentioned already. So let me finish with a few highlights of what NSF is trying to do to address some of these issues. One of the things that you hear all the time in all of the examples that I gave is the increasing need for interdisciplinarity of research while maintaining disciplinary excellence. And there it's both ways, helping the community to engage in it more effectively through funding mechanisms, and secondly, adjusting NSF's internal processes such that NSF organizational structure doesn't become the impediment to interdisciplinary research. And both are equally important. So partly to address that particular issue, about a year and a half ago, 10 program officers at NSF came together in a working group to create this program called Inspire. And one of the leaders of that effort, Rich Benke, is here. And the Inspire program tries to create a mechanism both internal to NSF and external to our PIs to try to identify potentially high risk but highly disciplinary projects that are not obvious in traditional ways of thinking. And because it's a new program, we have an opportunity to set up the right metrics. So about a few months ago, we launched 40 of the new awards. A second solicitation is just out for next year that has 3 different components: a regular Inspire Award for multidisciplinary research, a mid-scale research project, plus individual awards to identify outstanding people. So I strongly encourage you to take a look at that solicitation and respond to NSF's call for the proposals. I want to say a little bit about the innovation ecosystem. Everybody talks about it, and people often worry when you mention innovation, does it mean that is NSF going to go away from basic research to translational research? So let me put that fear to rest with a very categorical and emphatic statement that NSF's mission has always been, and as far as I can see, will continue to be basic research. We will not veer away from that basic mission. But historically, with that mission, NSF has played a huge role. Google is just one example, not small, but one example of this. There are other examples of this. So if you look at this graph, this captures the entire innovation ecosystem within NSF. We are mostly to the left, to the extreme left, where everything we do is basic research. But for decades, we have also done other things that gently nudge the product of that basic research closer to economic value. So NSF was the very first federal agency decades ago to start the Small Business Innovation Program. Now there are 13 federal agencies that do this. In a minute, you're going to see a video of the impact of that. We also have engineering research centers, science and technology centers, etc. Last year, we launched a program called the Nsf Innovation Core. And the idea behind that is very simple. About $6 billion a year that we spend, all of that pretty much leads to publications. Many of them lead to patents. But very few of them go beyond publications, not because the PIs aren't smart enough, not because they are not interested in it, but because the vast majority of the institutions in which our PIs work don't have the ecosystem to support the entrepreneurship. NSF, given its reach and stature, can play a huge role without taking money away from basic research. So we put in only $5 million into this last year. We started with 100 projects last year, and this year we'll have 200 new projects. Many of them have gone well beyond publications, and if you talk to the PIs, they will tell you that without NSF help, they could not have done this at a time when universities don't have the resources to support it. We have 5 national hubs. We'll have 5 this year. We already have 3, Stanford, Georgia Tech, and University of Michigan. There is a solicitation and a selection process underway for 2 additional hubs to help foster this through universities. And NSF can play a critical role. The biggest metric of success is somebody wants to emulate you. There are 2 other federal agencies that want to take the I-Core and want to create I-Core in their own organizations. So this is one example of something that NSF can do.
And fortunately, the National Science Foundation came along at just the right time and offered a grant for small business.
Qualcomm was very small when it received its first SBIR grants, I think in the order of 15 people or so. That helped us continue ahead, grow, develop some technology.
Well, it meant the difference between starting and not starting. It meant everything in those early days. And now, today, it employs over 18,000 people.
We now employ something over 21,000 people.
It all started with that little $25,000 grant.
And so these things have very large multiplier factors to them.
What really causes economic growth is it's always innovation. So how do we get more of it? We invest in basic research. That's as simple as that.
That's a great place to stop. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Suresh, for that very informative and engaging presentation. I think we now know the reason why Neil Armstrong did not take his suitcase to the moon.
Yes.
We do have time for questions, and there are microphones in the aisles. Okay, we'll start here.
Hi, I'm Terry Tullis from Brown University, and we go way back. All of us love NSF, and those of us who know you, Subra, are delighted that you were the head of NSF, because you're just a great guy and you've got a lot of insights into things. There's two questions I want to raise. One is, we've been hearing, at least we used to hear for years, that NSF's, but that we wanted to get on track to double NSF's budget in 10 years, which is 7.5% or so per year. And obviously in the current economic climate, that's not what the rest of the budget is doing in Washington. But given the huge cost-benefit ratio that NSF has and the bipartisan support, it still seems to me that we ought to be doing better than 4.5% or 2.5% or whatever we end up being. So I'd be interested in your thoughts about what are the possibilities of doing that, how can we help, and then I've got a smaller kind of question.
Okay. So I think, let me start with how can we help part of it. First of all, before I go to that, Terry, it's nice to see you. Terry and I were faculty members together at Brown University, so it's very nice to see you. How can we help? I think the community, we constantly do. We communicate it to our elected officials. I think that there's never been a greater need to communicate it than now on the role of agencies like NSF. I don't want to be too selfish and talk only about NSF. I think this applies to all of our science funding agencies, whether it's the Department of Energy Basic Science or NIH or NIST and others. It's very important that I think that we need to do that. Regarding your question about doubling of the budget, so the impetus for doubling of the budget was the America Competes Act. The America Competes Act came into existence in 2007 by unanimous vote in the U.S. Senate, which was pushed by Senator J. Rockefeller at that time, was because of a report of the National Academies called Rising Above the Gathering Storm. And there was enormous enthusiasm for it. But then when the America Competes Reauthorization Act happened in December of 2010, it was highly partisan. And there was not enough vote for it. It was somewhat lukewarm. The America Competes Act did a lot of things. It led to the establishment of ARPA-E. It reinvigorated the conversation about doubling of NSF budget and so forth. So I think there is discussion in Congress now about revisiting that and reauthorizing it and talking about the importance of basic science. Now is the time to do that. I think the community should engage, the science community should engage to articulate their perspective on this. Regarding your question on doubling of the budget, the administration is extremely supportive of doubling the budget, as is select groups in Congress. But the only thing we don't know yet is it'll double over what period of time. And that's just a crucial piece of information that's missing at this time. So that's what we know at this point.
If I might, the smaller question I have concerns the facilities. My understanding is that within NSF, and I don't know a lot about the internal workings, you have suggested that the facilities program should be scaled back a little bit in order to not lose the individual investigator support. But my perspective is that at least some of these facilities are not big facilities. So for example, in EAR, there's an implementation of facilities program that mostly supports people like me in the laboratory who want to get some new piece of equipment or design some new piece of equipment. And if that budget gets cut, it affects our ability to do the individual research that equipment supports. So it's something I think we should have a conversation about. And maybe I misunderstand what the situation is.
Yeah, no, actually, let me make a factual correction on this. It's not NSF's decision to cut back on the investment on facilities. It's congressional. So we have an account called MREFC. In 2011, Congress cut the budget for MREFC by 50%. So it was not our decision. It's a separate line item. It was cut by Congress by 50%. We went back arguing that that was a big mistake for the reasons that you just mentioned. And a lot of that was not all of it was restored. A significant part of that was restored. But Congress made one other decision. And they said, okay, fine, if that is important, rather than we giving you a separate budget, you as the director of NSF, you decide if you want to put $50 million into, if you want to put money into big facilities, we let you do it. You take $50 million out of your research budget and you put it into facilities. They gave me the authority to do this. But here is the problem with this. If I want to build a new telescope or a new research vessel or a new network in the country or some other program, if I exercise that authority to the fullest extent, I have to take money away from pure mathematics, theoretical physics, other fields. So the question naturally comes in a zero-sum game. Why should the mathematicians give up 100 projects so that the geoscientists can have one extra research vessel? So that's the kind of no-win situation that we get into. So to your point, we are fully supportive of facilities. So it's not our decision to cut back on the budget. It also comes from one very important point to note is usually from the community where the money goes for facilities. For example, in astronomy, almost 60% of the budget for the astronomy division goes for facilities. Not by our choice, but by their choice. So they have the decadal survey, and they give a prioritized list of things that they want NSF to invest in. And based on that, we provide significant resources. You go to mathematics, which is the counterexample, 85 to 90% of the funding is individual support. That's what they want. If mathematicians came and said, I don't know what facilities they would ask for, number 2 pencils, something like this, we would buy them very gladly. So it comes from the community. So the community has to, we cannot take money away from one field to fully support another field, but given that balance that we have to strike, it's up to the community what they want to live with. You want big facilities, you want individual funding, or some combination thereof. So that's another place where we could use your input.
I guess all I was thinking was that there's a difference between big facilities and sort of small facilities, and it might be worth thinking about sort of the proportion of cuts in those, because you can save a lot more money by cutting on the big ones than on the small ones, and the small ones affect people more in some ways. So.
Yeah, but there is one other point I want to make. It's easy to create facilities. It's very difficult to sunset them.
Right.
And communities don't let us sunset anything. In fact, just like the old British Empire, the sun doesn't set over NSF.
So do we have any more questions? Okay. I have a question. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on the fiscal cliff, not only in terms of what it means in dollars, but more, say, in the context of the shifting demographics that you talked about. I mean, there's already that trend there.
Okay.
Will the fiscal cliff, and if it were something that continued on, how would it affect our relative position in the world in terms of leadership?
So I think, so let me give you the numbers. Nobody knows at this point where we will end up, because it's still a very dynamic process. But let's look at the best case scenario and the worst case scenario, hopefully two extremes that we can think of as we know today. And of course, this could change tomorrow. On the optimistic side, if we don't go to the edge of the cliff, we stop before that and have some reasonably rational discussion about the budget process for the next few months, then it's possible in an optimistic scenario that we would end up with either a flat level budget or a slightly increasing budget for NSF of the order of a few %. Let's look at the worst case scenario, the most pessimistic scenario. If on January 2nd, if there were to be across the board automatic cut that were to kick in, not according to me, but according to the Office of Management and Budget, the projection for NSF, NIH, and a few other agencies is an automatic 8.2% cut. That 8.2% cut will translate into 1,000 fewer awards next year. But there are a few buts in that question. Even in the worst case scenario, we are in a continuing resolution that goes through March 27th. You cannot initiate major new things in a continuing resolution. So even in the worst case scenario, between January 2nd and March 27th, there are some possible scenarios. And again, what happens between January 2nd and March 27th will determine how we respond to that. So there's a lot of moving pieces to the puzzle.
Hi, David Clark. I'm from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Over the last 6 months, there seems to be, at least in my scientific community, a concern that science is going more towards, or there's an emphasis on data collection and a decreased emphasis on data analysis. And the concern is that if this trend continues, that there might be a lot of data, but there won't be a lot of scientific results actually developed out of that. Can you comment on how NSF might seek to, I don't know, how that balance might play out in NSF's future?
Happy to. It's a very good question. In fact, day before yesterday morning, we had an hour-and-a-half session as part of the National Science Board meeting looking at exactly that question. So, we have hypothesis-driven research. And, what they call the fourth paradigm is going to be data-driven research and mining of data. So one of the goals of this would be, say, geosciences and physics independently collect huge amounts of data, and somebody from engineering or mathematics or economics or psychology mines the data and creates new knowledge out of it. And how does NSF facilitate it? At multiple levels, we can do that. At the program level, in fact, I hope that this will be one of the outcomes at steady state of a program like Inspire program or SEAS or SIF 21, where you have across-the-board activities out of which different communities can interpret results in very different ways, and that'll be very healthy for science. Another way to address that problem that we have done is the White House launched on March 29th the Big Data Initiative, and NSF is the largest investor in this. So the first program to come out of the gates was jointly between NSF and NIH in bioinformatics. And again, data is a big part of that, data analysis. When it comes to data analysis, NSF is in somewhat of a unique place because we can fund that pretty much in every corner of NSF, from policy side to economic side to modeling side to computer and information sciences to archiving to engineering, etc. So some of the discussions that we are having is also how do we make sure that we fund today issues related to data and data analysis, data analytics, that 10 years from now will be the norm, and how do we ask the right questions today with the help of the community? So again, there is a lot of ongoing investment within NSF, and this is very much on our minds. And the last point I want to make related to your question is there are a lot of policies that we don't have. Access to data, public access to data, because one of the expectations is that when you make data available to anybody, to the general public, you can actually foster a large economic activity and greater innovation. So how do we do that, and what kind of policy should NSF have? And then there are lots of questions beneath that. So we've been working for the past year or so on NSF policies. They are not ready to be released yet, but I just want to let you know that there's been a lot of conversation going on inside NSF related to that.
Okay, we'll take one final question here.
Natalie Beckman with Colorado State University. I just wondered, you mentioned the big discrepancy between students going into engineering in China and the U.S. Is that something that you see we can do things about? Is that something that is due to background culture that we can't change very much? And what do you see as things that we can do to change that?
I think it's a very complex factor. It's from cultural to a lot of other issues as well. I think the biggest problems that we have, in addition to any cultural issues, are that if you look at undergraduate freshman year, the number of students that want to come into science and engineering, and those who go beyond freshman year into sophomore, junior, and senior years, only 40% of those who want to major in a STEM field end up majoring in a STEM field. We lose most of them at the end of the freshman year. So there has to be much greater emphasis on how do you address the freshman year issue. So we've had a couple of projects that are just being launched, one in 2012, that don't look at field by field or department by department, but look at an institution. Take an entire institution, see if you can gather some meaningful data out of an entire institution, and see if there can be some policies or practices that can change. Then we can implement it across the board. That's one issue. Then there are other complicated issues in addition to cultural issues, and some of that is being discussed now. One of the ways in which we have made up for it in the past is by the U.S. being a magnet for talent from all over the world. And now, with mounting competition from around the world, how do you address that? And one of the key components of that is immigration policies and laws. And that's why there is so much discussion. There is another bill that's just been introduced in Congress to address that issue. And that needs to be taken up. So it's a very complex issue. And it has a huge economic argument. So let me just leave you with this economic thought. The bill that's being introduced in Congress right now says 50,000 visas for immigrants who get a PhD in science and engineering to be allowed to stay in this country, right? Look at the economic argument of this. By many estimates, recent estimates, if a child is born in the U.S., from the time of birth to the time of the end of college at age 22, depending on whether they go to public university or private university, the average cost to a family to raise a child from age 1 to age 22 is about $500,000, including college costs. Okay? So 50,000 people in STEM education coming to the U.S. at age 22, some other taxpayer has paid for it already. So 50,000 times $500,000 is $25 billion a year for STEM investment. That's 3.5 times NSF budget. So I'll leave you with that thought.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Subra Suresh for a very fascinating presentation.